you'll remember, we're talking about church history, and we're taking the period from about the 1300s to the 1600s. And so today I'd like to talk about the 15th century with you all. So I made, again, one of those handy dandy timelines. Don't throw it in the trash. I spend so much time on this. I shouldn't spend as much time as I do. So, but I feel like there's a lot of things on here that, I could probably teach a whole, 3-hour class just on the 15th century because it is such an exciting time. We've got the Renaissance happening. We've got the Age of Exploration just beginning. We've got lots of wars happening in France and in England, in Spain. There's all kinds of exciting things happening there. So take a look at that timeline just to give yourself some historical context, because again, the church is not a vacuum. The church doesn't happen outside of the culture, outside of the rest of history. The church is very much enmeshed with history. And so a lot of these things that are happening with members of the church. And I'll give you some examples as we go on. But I just want to remind you about that, because the church is part of history. The church, that is her mission, is to make herself part of the history of our world. So just keep that in the back of your mind there. And I thought we'd start with a prayer together. And this prayer is a prayer for Christian unity, because one of the things we're going to be talking about today is the Council of Florence, which was a council that really had the goal of Christian unity in mind, and kind of a little bit of a tragic thing that happened with the council, but it was one of the goals. So ut unum sent means that they may be one, and that was the prayer of Jesus at the Last Supper. If you read the Gospel of John, you can read the prayer that they may be one. So I thought we could pray together. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord Jesus Christ, at your Last Supper, you prayed to the Father that all should be one. Send your Holy Spirit upon all who bear your name and seek to serve you. Strengthen our faith in you, and lead us to love one another in humility. May we who have been reborn in one baptism be united in one faith under one shepherd. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Could I ask a favor? Does anybody have a watch I could borrow? My phone is being repaired. I want to make sure that I'm not taking up too much of Dr. Papasor's. Thank you very much. Dr. Papasor's time. Okay, so I thought that this century, the 15th century, is again one of great excitement as far as the Renaissance goes in particular. It is a century in which there is a lot of things happening outside of the church and within the church, especially at the beginning of the century with Christian unity. So we also have the fall of Constantinople, which is kind of the end of all of this. But I wanted to talk about kind of three main things. The first is this goal of Christian unity with the Council of Florence. The second thing I wanted to talk about was the Renaissance and the Renaissance papacies, because that gets a lot of traction. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was Spain and the Spanish Inquisition. So those are my three goals for today. We'll see if we get through them all. I really hope we will. So I wanted to start with the Council of Florence. The Council of Florence actually was in 3 different locations. So church councils like to bounce around, especially at this time of the church year, or the church history of the church. It began in the Italian city of Basel, which is in northern Italy. Sometimes you will see the Council of Basel referred to as the Robbers' Council, because it began as a church council that was called by the Pope. However, it ended, the Council of Basel ended formally with being moved to the city of Ferrara. However, some of the cardinals did not like that it was moved, and so they continued their own council at Basel. So if you hear it referred to as the Robbers' Council, it's because some cardinals and bishops decided to continue the council without the approval of the Pope, which is a necessary component for a church council to be called. So it moved to Ferrara, and at Ferrara, the traction really began to happen toward unity with the Eastern churches. However, it had to be moved from Ferrara to Florence for two reasons. Number one, Ferrara was not very convenient for the Eastern Christians to get to, and number two, there was an outbreak of the plague. So they had to move it to Florence, which was a little bit easier for the Eastern Christian delegates to get to. I would say the Council of Florence is really a very exciting and yet kind of a tragic church council. It's one of the reunion councils. Another reunion council would be the Council of Lyon in 1274. And some of the key actors in the Council of Florence were, of course, the Pope, Pope Eugenius IV. We have the Italian Cardinal Cesarini, who is kind of the delegate of the Pope, his personal delegate, you could say, acting on the Pope's behalf. We have Emperor John Palaiologos, who is the Emperor of Constantinople. It's very noteworthy that he is at this council. We have Bishop Isidore of Kiev, which is in Ukraine, who at that time was part of the Eastern Orthodox Church, not a part of the Western Rite at all. And then we have the Patriarch of Constantinople, Joseph II. So we have some important members, not only from the Western Church, but more importantly from the Eastern Church, who have, on their own initiative, decided to come to this council. Now this is really important because the break with the Eastern Church happened all the way back in the year 1054. So we've had almost 400 years, well, over 400 years of divide between the church at this point in time. So there was a real desire on both sides of this council to see unity happen. And that is really important to see that happening. Let's see, Pope Eugenius was actually personally in attendance at the Council of Florence, which popes are not always in attendance at a church council, so the Pope Eugenius was. And we have, again, like I said, this is a truly ecumenical council. So some of the goals of the council was, number one was conciliarism, which we dealt with conciliarism last time. That was the idea that the church councils should be in charge of kind of delegating and ruling the church, with the Pope just being a member of the council. So we have the issue of conciliarism, which actually pretty well gets under control with the Council of Florence. We have the idea of papal supremacy, which obviously is a contentious one if we're dealing with the Eastern churches. That is a real sticking point with the Eastern churches, is papal supremacy. We have papal supremacy, there we go. We have the idea of purgatory, which I'm not going to touch on that too much right now, but that is also another issue with the Eastern churches. And we have the big one, reunification with the Eastern churches. So I'll just give kind of a brief history of the division between East and West, just to kind of set the stage a little bit. So back all the way in the 9th century, in the 800s, we have the beginning of division with the Eastern and Western churches. And a lot of the division between East and West really has to do with geography, and the fact that that was a contentious time politically within the whole entire kind of area. So there wasn't just theological differences, it was a lot of political differences. And it was also a lot of geographical differences. There was just no good way to get information back and forth between the eastern parts of the old Roman Empire and then Europe. So some of those things have to do with that. However, there is a lot of, like I said, political things that were happening too. The West was not always willing to help out the East when they needed help. And one of these things that happened all the way back when Charlemagne was emperor. So this goes back to quite a while. And part of the issue was that the church in Constantinople, because they were the remnants of the Roman Empire, felt that they had a supremacy that was on par with Roman supremacy. because they were the remnants of the Roman Empire. Now, obviously that was a contentious thing with the Pope being the head of the Roman Church. And so really papal supremacy, I would say, is really at the heart of division between the East and the West. However, there are these other issues that cause problems. And one of those issues is the issue of the filioque. The filioque. Filioque means from the Son. And this is the issue of whether the phrase the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son can be included in the creed. What happened was that there was a council in Constantinople way back in the 300s, 381, that did not include the filioque within the creed at that time. However, it became a part of Western tradition to include the filioque, and Charlemagne kind of stuck it to him a little bit by requiring that to happen within all of the churches in his jurisdiction, and the East really took offense at that. So the idea that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and from the Son was something that the Eastern churches felt like that was not part of the creed that came out of Constantinople. So why are we including this within the official creeds that we are saying? And the fact that the Roman Church was doing something that had not been discussed at an ecumenical council was something that was very hurtful to them. Now again, this is all tangled up also with the idea of papal authority and papal supremacy. The fact that Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem should be they should be sees, excuse me, not papal sees, but they should be sees that were on par with Rome was something that they also took issue with. However, when we get to the Council of Florence, we see a real desire by the patriarchs and by the Emperor of Constantinople to put the issue of papal authority to rest. And they were all willing to accept the authority of the Pope as the highest authority, as long as those other four sees were recognized as important sees within the church. So they wanted recognition, but they were willing to accept that the Pope had the primacy over the church. So with that issue kind of out of the way, it allowed for the idea of the filioque to be more accepted. Now what they decided was really interesting. The Eastern bishops and patriarchs decided that they would agree with the filioque clause theologically, but they would not have to include it within their creed. And so I believe that that is still how their creeds are today. So it is a theological issue that they agree with, and they assent to that dogma, but it is not within their creed. So those were kind of the big things. And so we have, again, we have the Emperor of Constantinople, we have the Patriarch of Constantinople, we have the Bishop of Kiev in the Ukraine, which was an important link up into the eastern part of Europe, all agreeing to these things. And what happened was that for a time there was a lot of enthusiasm, and at the end of the Council of Florence, there was thought that all of these Eastern Rite churches would be brought back within the fold of the Catholic Church. And there's a lot of enthusiasm and excitement. And unfortunately, what happened is that they were unable to make those things come to fruit within their own jurisdiction and within their own areas. In fact, most of the men who agreed, most of the men from the Eastern Church who agreed with this reunification kind of became outcasts, and a lot of them no longer lived within their sees or within their jurisdictions after they came back, because there was such hostile feelings that came out of this. The one man who was at the Council of Florence from the East, Bishop Marcus, and I cannot remember where he was from, but he did not agree with these things. And so he is actually considered a saint in the Eastern Rite, or not in the Eastern Rite, but in the Orthodox Church, because he disagreed with what was happening. And a lot of it had to do, again, back to those political and geographical differences. The fact that the West was not willing to kind of not only agree with them theologically, but help them out politically when they were in a really tight spot. And so, although there was a lot of enthusiasm that came out of the Council of Florence, it quickly kind of tanked after they came back home. And reunion pretty much became unable to happen after the year 1453, because that is the year that Constantinople was destructed by the Ottoman Turks. Did you want to ask? Yeah.
Well, I don't know, just, and help me if I'm wrong, but would you say that a lot of this split, it almost sounds not theological as more as it seems man's ego and
that's really
power.
true.
I mean, it's unfortunate and it, continues today, but if you, take the word of God and, I mean, I'm saying, just, that's what I'm hearing now, if I'm wrong, that's what
And I would really agree, and I always wonder, how the Holy Spirit feels about himself being this big contentious part of, the split between Christian unity. It must be very sad. And I would say it's both an East problem and a West problem. The Western Church for a long time didn't really recognize the important theological ideas that were coming out of the East. I mean, for a long time, the Eastern Church really was the seedbed of these ideas, these really important things about the nature of Christ and about the nature of the Holy Spirit and the union of the persons in the Trinity. The East was really kind of the seedbed of those beautiful ideas. And so, in some ways, I mean, we're both at fault, right? But I would agree. I think that there is a lot of pride that happened in this. Yeah.
But those Eastern churches that are united with Rome, when did they come back in, or did they never split?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'll come back to that one.
Okay.
Well, sometimes we throw out these terms with respect to division, because the Eastern Rite Church is Catholic, and the Orthodox is also considered Eastern, but it's not Catholic. So
Right.
Where is the division? Is the division between the Eastern Rite or the Orthodox? Because it's a big difference.
Right, you are very true, and I probably have been using words interchangeably that I shouldn't. So when we talk about the Eastern Orthodox Church, we are talking about the church that is separated from us. We are talking about like the Russian church, Russian Orthodox. Anything that has Orthodox but not Catholic in it is our separated brothers and sisters in the East. However, if we talk about the Greek Catholic Church, or there are a lot of Eastern rites,
Byzantine Catholic.
the Byzantine Catholic rites, those are all Eastern rites within the Roman Church. So those Eastern rites, we call them Eastern rites, are within the union of the church.
So is this council with the Orthodox or with Eastern Rite?
Well, so what happened here at the council was with everybody. This was with all Orthodox. There was, at this time, when they divided in 1054, everyone that was basically east of Constantinople went Orthodox, basically. There was like one rite that remained Catholic. And I'm simplifying it just a little bit, but basically everybody east of Constantinople became Orthodox and was split from the church. At this council in 1431 at Florence, the desire was to bring everybody back over. And so that's why there were representatives from Constantinople, there were representatives from what is considered like the Ruthenian Rite, which is the Ukraine. There were representatives from some of the different rites within the Eastern Orthodox Church, but they all wanted unification. That was their desire. However, that unification did not happen with pretty much anyone at the Council of Florence. No one was really united back. The reunification happened little by little with those Eastern Catholic rites that came back into the fold, kind of one here, one there. It began in the later 1500s, and I'll mention it next time. I think the Ruthenians came first, which is Ukraine in that area. And then we have like the Malabar Christians, we have the Byzantine Christians, and they kind of all are coming back a little at a time, a little group here, a little group here, but they have, if you're aware, like we have a Byzantine Rite Catholic service here at the Spiritual Life Center, a Mass. That is still here, right, Dusty? Am I right or no?
Hasn't been for a while,
Okay, all
but
right, never mind.
might periodically, yeah.
Okay. For a while, we had the Byzantine Rite Mass celebrated here at the Spiritual Life Center. That was obviously a Catholic, within the fold of the Catholic Church, but just a different rite. So there are lots of different rites, actually, especially among the East. So, yeah.
You know, I was in Odessa for a year, and there were 4 different rides. But I had to really be careful
Right.
to get because that's in the Russian part of Ukraine,
Right.
and it was difficult to figure out where I'm supposed to go to church.
Yeah. I
It's
can
still
imagine.
going on.
Yeah, right. Right. And I can't imagine to be, Catholic in that part of the country, you would, I mean, a lot of this is ethnic too, right? A lot of these rites have to do with ethnicity as much as a specific ritual tradition. So, a lot of it is, the Ukrainian rite or the Armenian rite or the Malabar rite. All of these things are also along ethnic lines there, whereas, within the Western lung of the church, we have one rite, So it's a little confusing for us to understand as Latin Catholics versus Eastern Catholics, so.
This Senate acceptance of the Florence agreement, is it at the church level, or was it the grassroots of lay people?
I would say maybe more at the church level, but I think that there was a desire. I mean, you see patriarchs from different parts of the Eastern Church coming, so there must have been something stirring that up within them. It's really interesting, as a side note, to follow like the emperors of Constantinople, because things in the Eastern Church swing dramatically depending on who was the emperor at what time. So the Emperor Michael Palaeologus was very much for unity. So of course, that the Constantinople Church also had a desire, more of a desire for unity under him. So yeah. So but 1453 is really the end of this kind of desire and reaching out across the aisle for unity. And I feel like if the Western Church would have made an effort to be there at the destruction of Constantinople, perhaps things would not be like they are now. So again, it's just as much that pride on both sides that has made this reunion impossible. So does anybody else have any questions about the Eastern reunification steps?
That destruction, was that a crusade that did that, during a crusade? Or?
No, it wasn't a crusade. It should have been a crusade, but at this point in time, we're a little bit past people getting enthusiastic about the crusades at all. The Pope can barely call a crusade to defend, parts of Europe at this point in time. He asked several times to defend cities like Venice and Otranto, cities that are like in Italy, and they're having a hard time defending those from the Ottoman Turks at this time. So the desire to go all the way over to Constantinople just wasn't there. There is one exception to that, and that's in Belgrade with St. John Capistrano, and I'll talk just a little bit about that in a minute. But no, what happened was the Ottoman Turks have been encroaching for quite a while into that area, and they finally kind of caught Constantinople at a very weak point. Constantinople had been weakening for 100 years or more, quite frankly, and it used to be considered impenetrable, right? Because of if you ever look on the map and see where Constantinople is, it juts out from the sea, so you would have to have a sea attack and a land attack to be able to overrun Constantinople. And for a long time, they were able to keep out the sea attack, but they figured out a way to get in basically by building tunnels and things and getting in under. And also there was the introduction of some new technology like cannons and things like that that made that finally able to destroy Constantinople. So, but I did want to talk about the Renaissance, because the Renaissance this is really the height of the Renaissance. If you look at your timeline there, you can see all kinds of amazing Renaissance things happening. We have the rise of the Medici family in Florence at this time. We have Michelangelo, yes, that's for years. And we have Leonardo da Vinci creating their masterpieces at this time. We have popes who are patrons of the art to the extreme sometimes with the Renaissance. So I wanted to look at the Renaissance kind of frankly and see, you know, what happened with the Renaissance, what was good, what was not so good about the Renaissance, because the Renaissance, I feel like the kernel of the idea of the Renaissance is very interesting. It began with this philosophy of nominalism, which at its roots comes from St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, you could argue that it kind of veers off from St. Thomas Aquinas if you wanted. But nominalism, among other things, placed the importance on the individual over the unity of the whole. So the individual person, the individual idea was more important than kind of where that individual began. So I know this is a philosophical thing, but this had a really interesting way of expressing itself, and that came out in the Renaissance. Now, nominalism started back in the 1300s with William of Ockham. So you could argue that the Renaissance started back in the 1300s, really, and I would agree with that. But also, not only we have nominalism, so the individual person is important and human activity is important. And so activity, individualism, kind of individuals meeting their potential is a really important idea of the Renaissance. We also have this upward mobility happening that wasn't happening back in the heart of the medieval age, in which lay people could become educated and could rise up in a way that outside of the church they could never do. So that's why I think it's interesting, like you have that even happening with like St. Francis's family, right? They were wealthy merchants, but you would never consider them to be, you know, artists or anything like that. But we have the Italian city-states becoming stronger and stronger, and with that wealth and with that mobility comes this rise of a wealthy middle class, and that is really the seed of the Italian Renaissance. Now we also have the Italian Renaissance happening, and we have the Northern Renaissance happening. So basically the Northern Renaissance is everybody else besides Italy, basically, excluding Spain, I suppose. But I'm talking specifically about like, you know, in Germany and kind of Northern Europe, the Northern Renaissance. So I just wanted to contrast the two. So the Italian Renaissance really kind of comes out of this rivalry from these Italian city-states, this desire to be the best Italian city-state. And if you study Italian history at this time, it's just all about which city is attacking which city and which wealthy family is in control of Venice or which wealthy family is in control of Siena, because the whims of those wealthy families kind of what happened with those wealthy families was what happened with the rest of the city. So there's a lot of infighting and kind of wars between these Italian city-states. Whereas in the north, we don't have a very city culture. There's not a big city culture. It's still more monastic, I guess you could say. There's not as much emphasis on what's happening within the cities. In the Italian Renaissance, we have a rebirth and rediscovery of classical antiquity. Now, classical antiquity, what I mean by that is Greek and Roman antiquity. So the rediscovery of Plato and Aristotle is happening at this time. Not only in Italy, but it's really actually coming out of other places. But we have the rediscovery of classical antiquity, whereas in the north, we have a return to Christian antiquity. And what I mean by that is the church fathers, kind of a return to the roots. So in Italy, it's a return to classical roots. In the north, it's a return to the roots of the church, okay? In the Italian Renaissance, we have the arts and new thinking flourishing. We have, of course, the great artists like Da Vinci, Michelangelo. We have architects like Brunelleschi, who designs the amazing Church of St. Mark's in Florence. I've got a picture here on the next, but it's just amazingly huge. We have the writings of Petrarch and Dante at this time, really returning back to the Greeks to get inspiration. Whereas in the north, we have these writers that are focusing on Christian thought, such as Erasmus and Thomas More a little bit later on. Jan Eijk is a famous painter at this time. So kind of the distinction that, that Vidmar makes and that I agree with is that the Italian Renaissance is a return to classical antiquity. The Northern Renaissance really takes fruition in the Reformation. He posits that the Northern Renaissance is the Reformation. That's why, Martin Luther wants to get rid of everything that happened in the Middle Ages and return to the roots of the church in a very radical way. And Thomas More and Erasmus, in a similar way, also want to return back to the church fathers. So, so there's that interesting distinction. So I would say, the Italian Renaissance happens first, but the Northern Renaissance, the Reformation, has huge radical implications that come out of it. So I thought I'd just show you a couple of the works that come out of the Italian Renaissance. So over here we have the Dome of St. Mark's in Florence. That was made by Brunelleschi and funded by the Medici family. We have Botticelli's The Annunciation here. Raphael's The School of Athens, again, kind of returning to that classical thought. We have the neo-Gothic, or we have the Gothic churches beginning to really take form at this point in time and turning away from kind of the Romanesque works of the medieval age. And then we have Jan van Eyck's altarpiece in Ghent, which is very, very famous. And kind of at the middle here, it's kind of hard to see, but you have kind of this Supper of the Lamb image right here. So Van Eyck is really interesting because he was the first ones to really make oil paints popular. And so the Italian masters that we see really got the idea to paint with oils from Van Eyck. So it's really interesting. So what everybody loves to talk about is Renaissance popes, right? So because they just are such a shining example of, good Christian examples. So I thought we would talk a little bit about the Renaissance popes here. I like what Vidmar says. He says, the criticism of the Renaissance papacies is both deserved and unfair. Deserved because these popes were concerned with the wrong things and could live scandalous lives, but unfair because kind of what came out of the Renaissance is the Reformation. But unfair because the Reformation was a much bigger event than can be reduced just to reform of corruption. So I feel like that's a fair assessment. Could these Renaissance popes have stopped the trajectory that the church was in? It's definitely possible that they could have, or they could have at least reduced the severity of what happened with the Reformation. But the truth is that the Reformation was much larger than just simply, making sure that the popes were good moral examples. It was much bigger than that. So I would say the best way to understand the Renaissance popes is to understand them more as desiring to live like Christian princes than like the vicars of Christ. The Renaissance popes were the head of the Papal States at that time, which was an Italian city-state. And so, just as much as they were in charge of, well, in their minds, just as much as they were in charge of the church, the universal church, they were also the head of the Italian city-states, and they had to keep the interests of those city-states at the forefront of their mind. So that is why a lot of the times they lived like Christian princes would at the time. So a lot of what happens and a lot of what people throw at the Renaissance papacy is that you know, they were more concerned with being patrons of the art and with building up the goods of the church as far as, you know, beauty and churches and things like that, which is very true, right? Some of the Renaissance popes were amazing patrons of the art. Probably the most famous is Leo X, right here, 1513 to 1521. He is the one who began the construction or the revitalization of the Vatican Library, and he really made it a world famous place that was a deposit of a lot of ancient knowledge that had been lost for a long time, and then when it was rediscovered, we have Leo X really gathering those things. But more often than not, you hear the criticism that they were nepotists. So a nepotism comes from the Latin word meaning nephew. So a nepotist was someone who wanted to promote their family to church positions. So that is why a lot of the, I like this map, or this little box here, because a lot of the popes are related to each other, as you might see here. And that was by no accident that they were related to each other. They would make their family members, most often their nephews, into bishops and cardinals within the church. That's why we see names like Colonna. The Colonna family is really an important family. We see the Borgia family. Here's a Borgia, here's a Borgia. There's another Borgia somewhere. Is a really important family. We see the Medici family is a really important family. The Farnese family is a really important family. And this was by no accident, because if they were to protect and to keep a stronghold on control of not only the wealth of Rome, but also keeping other factions out of control of Rome, then they had to consolidate power in some way. And one of the ways they could consolidate power was to make sure and fill the College of Cardinals with their family members. Because for an Italian family, the only people who can be trusted are your family, right? So if you're not family, then you cannot be trusted. So it was by no accident that there are these families that continue to reappear and reappear. What was needed at the time was, there was some, obviously you want to encourage this artistic renaissance that's happening. That was definitely a good thing, but what was needed was strong leadership and reform within the church. And instead what happened was a lot of infighting between these Italian city-states. And you will see when you read church history from the 15th and 16th century, you will read all about the church placing, you know, the Italian town of Siena under interdict because they attacked somebody else. That had nothing to do with theological problems that were happening in Siena. It had everything to do with the fact that Siena was at war with Florence, who at that time the Pope was supporting. So it really was not about theology, it was not about doctrine, it was about power at this time. We also see this threat of the Turks and the Ottomans happening at this time. I alluded to earlier the fact that the popes could not get a good crusade to defend towns on the eastern shore of the Italian peninsula. important towns like Venice and Toronto, it was a real struggle to get people to come together enough to even defend what could have turned into a huge disaster on the Italian peninsula. We also see at this time with the Renaissance papacy, we see a power struggle happening with the cardinals. Now the idea of conciliarism might have kind of gone undercover or gone under the surface with the Council of Florence. However, there was still this desire for the cardinals to be in charge and not the Pope. So there was this power struggle, right? Are we going to be a church that is a monarchy of sorts with the Pope, or are we going to be an oligarchical church where the College of Cardinals are in charge? And so one way that the Pope could take away power from the College of Cardinals was to put his relatives in there, because he knew that his relatives would side with him. So again, that power struggle, and then the desire for moral reform. It is very true that some of the Renaissance popes did not act in moral ways. Several of them had children that they then promoted within the bishops and within the College of Cardinals. We have probably the most infamous is Alexander VI, Rodrigo de Borgia, who had 9 illegitimate children, who had a mistress who lived in the Vatican with him at the time, and who, one of his sons, probably had another man killed within the Vatican at the time. So great scandals within the church, and a real need for the popes to be examples of moral goodness that just really wasn't there at this time. Does anybody have any questions about the Renaissance and the Renaissance papacies? I feel like the Renaissance popes, some of them were good men. They were good men, but they just didn't have the right focus at the time. They were thinking of the world, and they were not thinking of the other world. They were not thinking of their responsibilities to the faith as much as they were thinking of their political power.
What's the first year and the last year in that crowd?
Oh, yeah, I know this is really tiny. So they are starting 1417 with Martin V. That's the Pope who came out of the Council of Constance in 1415. That started then. So Martin V was the one who ended the Great Schism in the church, you know, when the church was divided with 3 different popes. So we're starting off at a pretty low point right here, right, with Martin V. And they end it all the way here in 1572 with Pius V, who's actually a saint, Saint Pius V.
So the Turkish invasion, that was Muslim, I take it?
That was what?
The Muslims?
Yes, yes, Muslims, yeah. Turkish, Ottoman, that's different Muslim invaders, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have the Turks coming from the south and the Ottomans coming from the east. So, Vidmar ends the Renaissance papacies earlier. He likes to end it with Leo X. Where's Leo X? Right here. He ends it almost 50 years earlier. So, I don't know. I don't know that it really makes a whole lot of difference, but so yeah, I thought I'd mention one thing, and that was this desire for moral reform was something that, it wasn't just something looking back that we can say, oh, that Renaissance papacy really needed some moral reform. It was something that was being called for by people at the time, and one of the big actors in this was Savonarola, who was preaching in, it was Venice. Yeah, I can't remember. I think it was Venice or Florence. So he preached, and he would preach directly kind of against these laxities and this artistic culture that had very little to do with the faith, that was so focused on classical antiquity that it excluded kind of a Christian bent. And Savonarola really railed especially against Alexander VI, Rodrigo de Borgia, who, you know, in some there's a truth to the fact that he was probably the worst of the Renaissance popes. So, but Borgia, or Alexander VI, actually kind of started the ball rolling on Savonarola eventually being burned at the stake. So there were consequences if you disagreed with the Renaissance popes. There were consequences if you called for moral reform in the Renaissance papacy. So, you know, there is that aspect too.
Don't you think between the Italian and the Northern Renaissance, they're both good. They just need to come together with both their great ideas.
I think you're exactly right. Yeah,
I see it.
yeah, I agree.
Because I see that, I mean, when you look at what the Italians did, I mean, you can go there and it's beautiful. So it's just they didn't come together and work together on it.
Right.
And was St. Catherine of Siena part of this? I think, did she try? She saw the corruption, and she won that.
She did, but she was back last century.
Okay.
She's the one who called the popes to return from Avignon.
There you
So,
go.
but yes, she did. She really saw the moral.
Much earlier.
Yes, a lot earlier. Right, right. One of the interesting things about the Renaissance popes also is that one of the ways that they were patrons was that they would canonize people from wherever they were from. So that's why you see a lot of people canonized from Italian cities at this point in time. Obviously, they were very good, holy people, but that's also part of the Renaissance papacy was to promote certain Italian city-states, and they did that by canonizing people from those cities. So, see a lot of Italians in this area that are
Where does Francis fit in there? Is he earlier or later, or when it was
St. Francis, he's 1200, so
Okay,
a couple
yeah.
of centuries earlier. Right, right. So, yeah, it's always need for moral reform in the church, unfortunately. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about was the Iberian Peninsula. I wanted to talk about Spain a little bit. One of my authors that I really enjoyed reading, Warren Carroll, he has a real fascination with Spain at this time, and in particular, he has a real fascination with Queen Isabella. So it's really interesting kind of reading like what secular history will give you, and then what Warren Carroll will give you about Isabella and Ferdinand. And you know the truth is in there somewhere, right? So I just thought I'd mention Spain at this time because the reason I want to mention Spain is because Spain really is exempted from everything that happens in the next century. And that's because of what happens in this century in Spain. So it's no coincidence that Spain really doesn't feel the repercussions of the Reformation. And it's due in large part to the work of Ferdinand and Isabella, for better or for worse. There are some things that they did that, you know, looking back through our historical lens, we, you know, are a little appalled by. But I thought I'd give you a picture of what Spain looked like in the 15th century. In this time, we have kind of 5 kingdoms in Spain. We have Castile, Granada, Aragon, Navarre, and then Portugal.
Navarra.
Thank you, Navarre. Very good. So Spain before this is kind of a consolidated Spain. Before that, it was kind of like the Italian peninsula or the German principalities. There were lots of different areas and provinces. But slowly over time, this is what Spain looks like around this time. Now, we talked a little bit last time about the Reconquista of Spain, and that had to do with expelling the Muslims from Spain. So in the 1400s, excuse me, we have Granada as being really the last stronghold of the Muslims in Spain. And we have a peninsula that has really those 3 different populations. We have Christians in a vast majority of Spain. We have Jewish populations, both within Granada and within Christian Spain. And we also have Muslim populations coming out of Granada, but also into the rest of Spain. Now, there are some really interesting things that you can attribute to the Muslim populations that come out of Spain. For example, a lot of the return to classical antiquity comes out of Granada and comes out of some of the philosophers that lived there. So, so it's just something to kind of take, like the writings of Aristotle get rediscovered at this point in time, and a lot of that comes out of this Spanish kind of conglomeration of different ideas that was happening there. So, but needless to say, there was a desire in Spain among the two big areas, Castile and Aragon. There was a desire for unity. And the desire for unity was based on a couple of things. Number one, it was a political desire for unity. They wanted to consolidate so that they could have more political power. The other thing that was kind of instigating this desire for unity was a desire for religious unity. And that really had a lot to do with wanting to expel the Muslims out of Granada. And so, Ferdinand and Isabel, Ferdinand was from Aragon, there we go. Isabel was from Castile, thank you. And so when those two, when they married, they were not king and queen yet, but that was the desire for them to be married, was that there would become this political unity. Now it's really interesting reading about how they did that, because Isabel was still very much in charge of Castile, and Ferdinand was still very much in charge of Aragon. So, so they still kind of maintained separate control over their areas, but with that marriage, there became less of a dividing line, I guess you could say. So they got married in the 1460s, and then became kind of rulers in reality in the 1490s. And so what happened is 1492 is a really important year in Spanish history. A lot of things happened. The first thing that happened was that they finally drove the Muslims out of Granada for good. So at this point in time, there's a really wonderful picture of the, I can't remember what his name is, of the leader of the Muslim community there, handing over the keys of the city of Granada to Ferdinand and Isabel. And it's a really, it's a really beautiful picture. I mean, he's very majestic and very, just very well poised. It's not a groveling scene at all. It's really beautiful. You should look it up. But the Muslims are driven out of Granada, and in 1492, since Granada is now a Christian city-state, Ferdinand and Isabel give the Jews and the Muslims a choice. They can either convert or they must leave. And this is a really contentious thing for us, especially looking back on what happened with the Jews and the Muslims. They did give them time. They gave them, but not much time. They gave them about 3 months to decide. So if you can imagine, 3 months to decide whether you're going to renounce everything you've ever believed in, or you're going to leave. Now, it wasn't the first time that the Jews had ever been told to leave someplace. This is something that has happened quite a bit in the past, especially with the plague. People would blame the Jewish people for the plague, and then the Jews of that city would be expelled from the city. So it's not something that is new to the time, but it doesn't make it any better that it happened. And the Muslims are also left with the same choice, to convert or to leave. Now, if they left, they had to leave all of their, not possessions, but they had to leave all of their money behind, basically. I mean, they could only take so much with them.
They left all the buildings, all the castles and the best architecture is due to the Muslims.
Right, exactly, yes, right. So I feel like in the long scope of this was actually a very hurtful thing to Spanish society at this time, because you have to remember the Jews were the only ones who could do banking at this time, because they were the only ones who could charge interest. Nobody else, by their religious beliefs, could charge interest. So a lot of building things kind of got put on hold. There was a university in Granada that basically collapsed because of this. And you know, there was a lot of cultural things that could have happened, but did not happen because the Jews and the Muslims were expelled. However, saying that, those Jews and those Muslims who did stay, they became a part of society. They became a part of Spanish society. And I really feel like the fact that Ferdinand and Isabel kind of desired this political and religious unification is the reason that there were no later kind of Reformation repercussions, and there were no later wars of religion on the Iberian Peninsula, because they really made it a point to have unity in those two really important areas. Now, obviously, I've just explained to you what some of the negative consequences of that are. However, there is that positive consequence. There was no, tearing apart of Spanish society 100 years later that happened in, Germany and France. So we can kind of take that with a grain of salt. What happened with the Jews and the Muslims being expelled. I also wanted to point out a really influential person at this time, which was Cardinal Jimenez Cisneros. Cisneros. Sorry, I'm sorry. Anyways, he is a really unique figure in the history of the Spanish church. He was very influential on Isabella. He was her personal advisor for a long time. Let's see. Yeah, he was a Franciscan, and he wanted to maintain the rigors of his Franciscan life, even though he lived within the Spanish court. So that was really interesting. The Pope actually told him, "You must live a more luxuriant life than you are currently living, because you're making it look bad to be a cardinal of the Catholic Church," basically. So he was a very, he really did have a great personal faith, and was very influential on Isabel's personal faith as far as the way that she prayed, the rigors that she lived out, the life of penance that she lived out, even though she was the queen. And I really feel like he is a big influence on a lot of the policies that she desires to carry out. Now, one of the things that he is posited with is being part of the Spanish Inquisition. It is very true that he was one of the Grand Inquisitors. So I wanted to talk about the Spanish Inquisition here, but yes.
Yeah, I think it's very important to mention also that in 1492, thanks to Ferdinand and Isabella, they discovered us.
This is true.
If it were not for them, the Americans were not literate, and because they brought the Catholic Church and literacy to this world.
Right.
So it's important to mention.
It is very true, and I'm sorry, I almost don't mention it because I'm just like, everybody knows that they went to America. So, but maybe not, right? Yeah, go ahead.
What was his first name? Cisneros?
Jimenez, no, Francisco Jimenez, sorry. Ximenez, Francisco Jimenez. Well, and I think that's important to mention too, because the only reason that Ferdinand and Isabella were able to continue on with sending people over to the New World was because they were not caught up in what was happening with the Reformation. So that's another interesting point to put out there. That age of exploration that was really led by Spain only happened. Well, I don't think only happened, but a major reason that it happened was because of that political and religious unity that happened on the.
But also a tiny bit. Christopher Columbus was going to the western world to get the spices.
Right.
They didn't have GPS in those days. He ended up in here.
Right.
So they were discovered by accident.
Right. You're right. And what is providence? Right.
Yes.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So yes, good things to think about. Good things to ponder. God can bring all kinds of amazing things out of really complicated situations. Right. So I wanted to talk about the Spanish Inquisition. Now, sometimes we get the Spanish Inquisition a little mixed up with the medieval Inquisition. So the medieval Inquisition, for a long time, was kind of the normal trial law that happened within the church. It was the church courts, basically. That was the medieval Inquisition. By the time that the Spanish Inquisition happened, that had been phased out quite a bit. We didn't have an inquisition within the worldwide church, but it got revived by Ferdinand and Isabella. And the major reason that it got revived was because it wanted to make sure that those conversos, those people that converted from Judaism and from the Muslim faith, were authentic converts. They didn't want them relapsing or being secretly practicing their previous faiths while they proclaimed to be a Christian. So that was the reason. And again, it goes back not so much for a desire to control every little aspect of someone's life, but it goes back to that desire for political and religious unity. They knew, Ferdinand and Isabella knew that if they did not have that unity, then there would be a lot of backsliding that happened. And not only just like idea backsliding, but political backsliding too, right? They had just finished an 800-year conquest of having the Muslims, of trying to get the Muslims to leave. They did not want to go back to that again because they knew what a huge fight that had been for such a long time. So, I mean, it's not just like, oh, we don't want people thinking their own thoughts. It really has to do with political unity, religious unity that has really big ramifications to the people at this time if that didn't happen. So we have the focus really in the first 60 years of the Spanish Inquisition, which began in about, well, let me just look, 1492, but it was 1480 was the first Inquisition that happened, the first execution that happened with the Inquisition. So for those first 60 years, it was really about those Jewish and Muslim converts. After the 1540s, the Inquisition kind of morphs a little bit more into weeding out heretics. And by heretics, it kind of means anyone who had a kind of dynamic personality sometimes. That's why Ignatius of Loyola has to go to the Spanish Inquisition. Teresa of Avila, some of her writings get put on the list of banned books, and she has to go before the Inquisition.
But they were never convicted.
They were never convicted, correct. But Teresa, she did have books that were on the list of forbidden books for quite a while. And, you know, one of the things about her is that, you know, she didn't revolt against that, right? She kind of allowed for that to happen, and realizing that, you know, the greater good that happens from submission is often the fruit.
It didn't really affect Ignatius Loyola, I don't think.
No, because he went to France.
Yeah.
He could do anything in France.
I really do, but I don't think you should put Ignatius out there.
Well, but Vidmar, he says that, you know, that Ignatius was called before the Spanish Inquisition. So I don't know when that happened. I think that was before he really got steamrolling with starting the Jesuits. This was before the
He
Jesuits.
was an adolescent, he didn't know it.
Right, there you go. Well, he just left too. He was just like, well, I'll just go study at the University of Paris. So yeah, so it kind of changed from enforcing the converts to make sure that they're have true conversion. Now, part of the Inquisition, when it was kind of at the height during the Conversos time, during those first 60 years, there was attempts by the papacy to stay the power of the Inquisition a little bit. And you can see Pope Sixtus, he tries to allow those people who have converted and who have to go before the Inquisition, he tries to allow them to have recourse to Rome to hear their case outside of Spain. And let's see, I think Vidmar puts it really well. Because they would use both the church courts and the government courts to control the persecution. Vidmar says he doesn't think that Ferdinand and Isabella were necessarily anti-Semitic. He thinks that that they went along with ideas that came out of kind of the lower classes, which at times were anti-Semitic in the time. However, you have to look at the fruits, right? You have to look at what really happened. So at times, they were very harsh on these, on the Jewish and the Muslim converts, especially the Jewish converts at this time, because a lot of the Muslims didn't want to convert, and so they wanted to just leave. But there are a lot of Jews who do stay. So another issue that the popes took issue with the Spanish Inquisition was that sometimes just anybody could accuse anybody of anything. And that did happen, not as often as we think probably happened, or as the history books like to tell us. But it did happen that people were accused just because you were a political enemy, or because they didn't like you, or for whatever reason. And the popes wanted the people that were being accused to have recourse to other courts outside of Spain to hear their cases fairly. Say his name again. Cisneros? Cisneros. Okay, so that was one of the things that I felt like is really interesting about him. He was a very severe person to come before in the Spanish Inquisition, but he was very just in the fact that he followed the rules and the laws that were set forth within the Inquisition. It was not as though it was the personal whims of the inquisitor that could decide a case for or against you, whether you would be burned at the stake. There were very specific laws and jurisdictions that were set forth, and there were consequences for not following those laws and jurisdictions. So Vidmar likes to give a little bit of perspective about the Inquisition, and I would mostly agree with what he says. The first thing he says is that there were a lot of holes in the process, meaning just because you were accused of something didn't necessarily mean you would even ever go before the Inquisition. Sometimes cases just got lost. The second thing he says is that the cruelty and the deaths that sometimes get attributed to the Spanish Inquisition are grossly exaggerated. Some people say, you know, hundreds of thousands of people, and Vidmar says between 3,000 and 4,000 people ended up actually being executed in the Spanish Inquisition. From its beginning in 1480 to its end, I think the last, let me double check this, the last execution was carried out in Seville in 1781 with the Spanish Inquisition. So that's a long time for 3,000 to 4,000 people to be executed under the Inquisition. I'm not trying to, you know, make it sound better, but we have to look at the facts. A lot of the exaggeration came out of the Reformation too, people wanting to vilify the church in various ways, and the Spanish Inquisition was a very easy target to do that with. Another thing that he says is that actually in Spain, torture was really not something that recourse was used to. Now you could definitely say, well, it's torture to burn somebody at the stake. Well, that's very true, but they didn't use torture as a means to get people to confess, like we usually see in Monty Python or whatever else. So that is a gross exaggeration as well. There's not torture being used on every person to make them confess, and you know, you don't have these false confessions so that they can quit being tortured. Those things just really did not happen with the Inquisition. Another thing that happened was that the church courts, the church Inquisition prisons, were actually preferred by people at the time to the state prisons because they were generally considered more lenient and better conditions in general. So that's something else to consider. You know, what are the political ramifications for things like even heresy at the time? You could be, you know, declared a heretic and have to go to a state prison. What were the ramifications of being, you know, a traitor to your country at the time? And, you know, the means of punishment in the state's prison versus the means of punishment in an Inquisition prison. So we have that to think about as well. And then oftentimes there were attempts to settle outside of court. In other words, you know, it's kind of like your dealings now where if you decided out of court, then sometimes it's just an easier process. And that was very true with the Inquisition. Another thing that he said was that sometimes, a lot of the times, large groups of people would be sentenced to death by burning at the stake, but what they would do is they would just burn like an effigy of that person instead of the actual person. So it's kind of a symbol that they were being burned at the stake, but they really weren't. So, you know, when you hear that, you know, 2,000 people were sentenced to death on, you know, this day, that doesn't necessarily mean that 2,000 people died on that day from the Inquisition. So just something to kind of keep in mind as we're studying this. So, does anybody have any questions about the Spanish Inquisition? Yeah.
I just wonder, you never mentioned the Basque population.
The Basque population.
Weren't they causing some problems?
They were. They were. I just don't have time for it. I do, but it's an interesting. I mean,
I shouldn't even say that. I wonder if there were more lynchings there or lynchings in the South than the United States.
it's very, very possible. Yeah.
They were not only in the south, but in Mexico.
Right. Right.
What people did you say?
The Basques.
Oh, they're
BAS.
not of the Basque. No.
Yeah. That's what he was talking about. The Basque. BASQ.
So we in the United States cannot altogether be innocent of it.
Exactly. Right. Definitely not. No. It's just like any political situation that you look at. I mean, any religious situation at this time also has political ramifications. Like, it's not like they're two separate things. They're always connected. So I wanted to mention a few of the saints of the century. The first one I wanted to mention is Joan of Arc, because I didn't even really get to talk about her much. But the 100 Years' War is still raging strong until Joan of Arc comes along. And the 100 Years' War, it ends in the middle of the 1400s. Yeah, thank you. 1453 is the end of the 100 Years' War with the French victory. Joan of Arc helps turn the tide toward the French to be victorious. However, she gets burned at the stake for being a heretic by the English who capture her. So her story is a little confusing sometimes. I remember being a kid and being like, what happened? Why did the Catholics say she was a heretic? So Joan of Arc. Another one that we have, a lot of the saints of the century, it's really interesting, do a lot of preaching. They do a lot of going out and preaching about things. So Frances of Rome was an influential, wealthy woman in Rome. She and her sister-in-law opened a home for plague victims, and then also began kind of a religious community of women that they could come and help within the Roman plague kind of community that was happening at the time, and then also just the sick that came out of that. We have Bernardine of Siena, one of those that was canonized by a Sienese pope. So, but Bernardine he's got an interesting story. I've got it here. Yeah, when he was 20, he got hit by the plague, but he escaped the plague, and he spent time caring for his aunt. But then after the plague, he kind of had a change of heart, and he entered the Franciscan order and reformed the Franciscan order quite a bit in Siena, and then went out to preach. He's the one that began the symbols IHS, so we see that on our altars and things like that, and he's the one who kind of began the tradition that came out of that, the first 3 letters of Jesus' name. He, like I said, reformed the Franciscans in Siena. They only had, 300 friars, and then by the time he died, around 4,000. So he was a big reformer within there. And then one of his followers was St. John Capistrano, and I alluded to him earlier. John Capistrano is really interesting. He's a disciple of Bernardine of Siena. He was sent to go preach in a crusade to stop the Ottoman Turks that were coming in through Hungary, and he was one of the only effective crusade preachers at that time, he brought together an army of about 7,000, and the siege of Belgrade is when the Ottoman Turks eventually were unable to move any further west, and that was really due a lot to St. John of Capistrano. So, yeah. So then we have St. Rita, who is, who I think I'm not going to discuss her too much, but I just wanted to mention those saints there. And then just to wrap things up, the church in the 15th century, we have the papacy and the cardinals concerned with worldly power and prestige. We have the center of power of the papacy really being Italian. The patronage of Renaissance ideals, but not so much ideals of theology. Saints of the day are preachers and national leaders. And then there is a concern for papal supremacy. We have the threat of invasion from the Turks and Ottomans, and then the beginning of that real desire for reform. And then the rise of powerful nations such as England, France, Spain, and the Italian city-states is happening, all in the background here. So that's all the time we've got for today. We've gone a long way.
Yeah.
Indeed.